Hola, buenos días. Good morning to everybody. I think we're ready to start. Sharp, on time. I think that's one of the good things about now this video conferencing. I think we are, especially in Mexico, I think we're a little bit more punctual than we used to be. No excuses on it. But thanks to everybody that is being part of this morning coffee, this conversation that we're having today with two very, very interesting people. And first, I would like to introduce Didi Caldwell, who is president of Global Location Strategies of GLS, our strategic partner in the US on site selection. And I mean, your resume is impressive when it comes to site selection, Didi. You've done it in over 30 countries. I don't know who has done it in more countries than you've done it. It's really amazing, and the level of experience that gives you on interacting with different cultures when it comes to selecting a site, which we know it's a very complex process. It's one of those things that mistakes come and hunt you back almost forever, right? There is no way to turn back the clock. So thank you so much for being here, Didi. And then also my business partner, Alejandro Mendoza, president of Prudenza Consulting Services, who's helped over 700 companies establish their operations in North America, and leading, of course, all our site selection strategies. Thanks, Alejandro, for being here this morning. I think the combo of you two here really, it's unbeatable in terms of experience and the things that we have seen in terms of site selection. So thanks to both of you for being here this morning.
Thank you. Great to be
here. And let's get right to it. The idea today is to talk a little bit about, this hot topic, which is supply chains and what that means. But I think also to talk a little bit about where do we see companies making decisions, what type of decisions, North America, and how this is going to be linked to site selection. So I'll start with a very broad question, Didi, and I'll start with you in terms of where do you see the biggest shift in terms of supply chains? I'm going to say from the philosophical point of view, at least, under these new scenarios, which I say is the COVID, USMCA, globalization point of view. What's your take on it?
Well, I think that we were already seeing some major shifts in global supply chain that were associated with demographics, geopolitics, trade and tariffs, all kinds of dynamics that were happening. And what COVID-19 has done is just sort of accelerated the pace at which those global supply chains are being realigned. It's my opinion that the risk that has been associated with these multi-level, multi-tiered global supply chains has been underpriced for decades. And one of the reasons it's been underpriced is because we have become accustomed to an economy that was fairly open and very few barriers to trade and very few supply shocks. And now we're seeing with the rise of nationalism and other demographic issues, the changing energy landscape, and now finally you put on top of that COVID-19, that the risk that's associated with every link in that supply chain is starting to rear its ugly head and show companies what the inherent risk is and what the cost of that risk is. So I think
I was talking yesterday on Instagram, but I was saying, and a little bit on the line that you're talking is, I think we've been spoiled, Didi, for 25, 30 years on not having to discuss too much in terms of risk, of levels of risk that we're seeing today, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it's really been since World War II that we have seen a global supply shock that has been as widespread and as long-lasting as we have seen now with this coronavirus shock. We've had some regional shocks in the past. I mean, certainly the Fukushima incident and how that impacted aerospace and automotive in Japan. We had the floods in Thailand, I think the same year, I think that was 2011, that impacted the microelectronics industry. Certainly in the US, we had Katrina, but we really, I mean, maybe you could say the global oil supply shocks back in the 70s, but I don't think that still rises to the level of what we're seeing now. And, particularly after World War II, when, the US took a big role in guaranteeing global security and trade and opened up its markets, and we went to a kind of world is flat model, we have become very spoiled. We have, we've been able to operate almost without geopolitical risk since that time period. And that is very much the exception and not the rule. And I think that we're going to revert back to some more traditional ways of operating, as opposed to living in this sort of hyper extended geopolitical reality.
Yeah. Now on this, Alejandro, I call it the pink dragon in the room, right? Not the elephant, but the dragon in the room. It always comes back to China and this, I'm gonna say, rhetoric about China. But what I know we spend as Prodensa a lot of time dealing with them. But what's your take on the future and what we can expect from China as a supplier for these industries? We're talking in general about different industries, but what's your opinion on that, Alejandro? What are you seeing with your team with China?
Well, basically, I mean, it all goes back 20 years ago, or a little bit more than that, when we were kind of looking at a China that was more starting like a contract manufacturing. But through the years, they actually built their own supply chain, which became very strong locally. So before all of this COVID-19 stuff, China was already struggling with finding a supply chain that can help them to get outside of China and be efficient outside of China. And I think that, at least on our experience, we have seen China moving forward, not necessarily moving themselves, but moving through mergers and acquisitions of some other companies somewhere else in the world. And I truly believe that besides the own manufacturing facilities moving outside of China or expanding outside of China, they started with the South of Asia, and we will see more and more coming into this direction. And the main reason behind that is, of course, associated with all of this that you guys were already mentioning, but also it's going to be associated with this, I would say, uncertainty on tariffs that can have a tremendous impact into whatever they're going to be making. And they need to be closer to the market that they want to be serving. I mean, this is going to be something where we truly believe that China is going to be moving really fast. They started before, but I guess that all of these supply chain shifts and the shock that everybody received is going to end up having more interest of Chinese corporations investing in North America, for sure.
Yeah, and your point is this precisely, is that, and we'll talk about nearshoring after this. I want to ask Didi that the question, but you're talking about the move of actual Chinese businesses that have been developed in the last 25 years or so, I'm going to say, to conquer their market outside of China, right, Alejandro?
Yeah, I mean, we need to understand as well that China developed their internal market. I mean, they grow significantly, and they have a very sustainable economy that they didn't have probably 25 years ago. But nowadays they have enough to have fun in China, but also they need, and they will come out of China to, take advantage of what they are doing. We need to also be precise into what we have been seeing lately. When it comes into manufacturing, sometimes people still believe that China is all about cheap labor. And the reality is not like that anymore. They have a lot of technology. They have a very impressive supply chain development locally. And I think that they learned it so fast, the integration of the supply chain. And their challenge right now is going to be to replicate that, but outside of China. And of course, that's an opportunity to find partners, which is a great opportunity for a lot of companies, because it's all about finding partners that they can support them, and also that they can help them to make that conquer that you were talking about, Emilio. But certainly, I see them moving forward in that direction.
Yeah, I think that for me, when I look at TV, there's one here in front of me. 25 years ago, when that moved to start making TVs in China, it has nothing to do with the TV that is in front of me right now. And in China, more and more, I think, especially on the electronics, became a partner for industry overall in terms of also the research and development. I think when we look especially on site selection, right, Didi, at the competitiveness of countries, in terms of scientific infrastructure, in terms of technological infrastructure, I think China is very strong. And with that, I will go and ask you, Didi, maybe you have some input also on this Chinese effect that Alejandro was talking about. But I want to ask you very straightforward, which is a connection to this point. What's your take on nearshoring, and on reshoring, nearshoring, however we want to call it, but this idea that we can bring things back from China, and how do you actually see it happening in North America, specifically in the United States, the possibilities for this to happen in the US efficiently today?
Well, let me expound a little bit on the China question, because I think it does impact the nearshoring concept. So, China's value proposition was originally cheap labor, like Alejandro said, and also access to its market, because it had a huge market that was very young at the time. But the one-child policy, those chickens are now coming home to roost. And so China for a long time was a consumption-led economy. Now its demographic is much older, and which means that its workforce is much more productive and has higher skills, which has contributed to the narrowing of the wage gap between China and the US, or certainly China and Mexico. And pretty soon, the Chinese are going to be aging into mass retirement, because like a lot of developed nations, Germany, Russia, Japan is already post-growth. They're aging into an area where it's going to be very difficult for them to sustain the economy as they have known it. The other thing that's going on there is that Beijing, definitely wants to maintain control, and so there's a lot of breakdown that's happening with some of their partners, specifically with Taiwan. If you look at the microelectronics industry, Taiwan produces a huge number of microelectronics that are then sent to China to be used in iPhones, to be used in televisions, to be used in washing machines. I mean, everything that has a chip in it. And if there's some discussion about whether or not China will maintain that policy of two countries and two systems, and if they do and that trade breaks down, then the microelectronics industry in China also breaks down. So I think we're going to see, just using that as an example, I think that's an opportunity in North America for the US and Mexico to start to produce some of that, bring that supply chain back here. We just saw a Taiwanese company that made a major announcement in Arizona for $1 billion chip fab plant. I mean, these are not inexpensive supply chains to move.
Correct.
But over time, I think it will be done. And I think some of the assembly that's done, the plastic injection molding, all of these things that go into the microelectronics that the chip is a part of, the integrated circuit is a part of, can move back to North America to be closer to its market, and also to reduce some of that supply chain risk. And I think in particular, Mexico is very well positioned to do that. So I fully expect to see, some supply chains are going to move much more quickly. I think, we're seeing it already with some of the PPE and pharmaceuticals and things that are of national security. But I think we're also going to see some of these other major shifts in supply chains, such as automotive and semiconductors.
Yeah, now I think one concern, and I'll leave this out for both of you, but maybe Alejandro, you can take first stab at it. One of the concerns that I have is that, again, I always say, for us, China in industry typically is not an enemy. Typically, it's part of our business cycle. It's our supplier. At most, it's a tough competitor. I say sometimes as a country not playing by the rules. But I think the fight with China also has a very big economic aspect for what you guys were saying, in terms that it represents a market for a lot of American companies. Just talking from the American point of view, which is most of our investment also in industry in Mexico. So picking a fight with China, it's also putting the uncertainty of my market on the line. right? Assuming that China can say, you know what, okay, that's the way you want to play. Well, I'm going to not allow for American goods to be sold in China either. So I don't know, Alejandro. I think this is also part of the risks that we didn't have in the past that we have to make part of our conversations today.
Yeah, certainly. And there are two sides of that, because on one side, you will have the political environment and this trade war that has been happening lately, and it looks like it's going to continue for a while. And that, of course, is going to, raise some flags and say, guys, we shouldn't go on that direction anymore. But at the same time, in the other side, what we have seen is that due to this pandemic, what we learned is that the supply chain effect, when the supply chain got interrupted, the effect was even bigger. It takes a lot of time when they shut down the facilities in China, all the effect that it had in America, and the other way around as well. So I think that when we talk about being, I wouldn't use protectionism, but let's call it nearshoring, whatever is going to be. I also believe that there is going to be an opportunity to serve the Chinese market is to stay closer to China. And we're going to see the same effect on this other side of the war, because certainly everything about tariffs, we believe that tariffs is just going to be a political aspect, and probably it is at some point. But in the other hand, logistics is just impossible. The cost of keeping inventory over the seas for 30 days or whatever is just unsustainable anymore. And this pandemic, it set every single sourcing manager to double think how is exactly their strategy working. This is not going to be sustainable for the years to come. And if you add into that the tariff war, then I think we're going to see an effect on both sides of the war. Chinese companies are going to be coming here, but also American companies will stay there to please the Chinese market.
Correct. Where do you see this conversation exactly? Go ahead, Didi. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, because we are starting to see the risks associated with these supply chains, the ways that companies, the options that they have in order to mitigate those risks, all have costs associated with them. So the easiest, and what I think we're seeing companies do in the near term, is just to build additional safety stock. That has cost, and it goes against the whole idea of lean manufacturing that we've been, this pursuit of the lowest cost of production. But it is a way to mitigate some of those risks, is just have more inventory on hand. Another way that you can do that is that you can have a second source of supply. So instead of just having a supplier in East Asia, you can also have a North American or a European supplier, so that if there is a shock somewhere in the world, you can source it from another provider. That also has cost, but it's sort of a medium term, could be a medium term solution. I think the longer term solution and the more strategic solution is to collapse your supply chain to a geographic, so that we start to see, and I think this is what Alejandro was alluding to, so we start to see regional, or I'm calling them hemispheric supply chains. So Correct. You've got the Americas serving the American market, you've got Europe and to a certain extent North Africa serving the European market, and then you have an Asian market that is being supplied by a supply chain in that market.
Hey, you use this phrase, which I've never used before, but this is the pursuit of the lowest cost of production. Do you see, Didi? And then I want to ask Alejandro, in terms of supply, finding new suppliers, which sounds romantic and very ideal, but just so you can think a little bit about your answer on that, how easy that is. But do you see, Didi, that the pursuit of the lowest cost of production will continue to be the trend? Do you think it's just a moment in time when it sounds good to say, let's make it in America, or let's make it in North America at best, regardless if the cost goes up? Where do you see that?
Well, I think that companies will continue to try to achieve that. I just think the ability to do that without taking into account some of these risk factors is going to be significantly inhibited, more so than it has been in the past. And quite frankly, because of the demographic globally, we're probably going to see a lot of the capital that has been financing new plant equipment, new technologies, new research and development, new advances. is going to start to dry up because there's a huge proportion of the world that is sort of aging into retirement. So they're going to be drawing on that capital instead of continuing to look for returns. And so I think we're going to see probably lower growth than we have become accustomed to. I think we're also going to see slower advances in technology, which is not encouraging for any of us. But I think that's probably going to be more of the norm moving forward.
Yeah, you know, I have the let me take a few minutes on this, but I still don't believe that the consumer, I think in some areas is going to change, and is changing from bio-organic to healthier products, etc. When you're more than willing to pay the premium of the real cost of making, you know, of growing a carrot, right? And I call it the real cost because it's harder to grow an organic carrot than a non-organic carrot, or not antibiotics and things like that. So I think we are, as consumers, getting more sophisticated. That's easier said in some levels of the social economical levels, even in the United States and in Mexico. So I think this drive for cost, and still our economy is based on a consumption model, which in Mexico is still not, because we are on an export model, but it's based at the end of the day on the consumption model of the United States. I don't know how this is going to change, and I don't know what industry, the role industry is going to play on it. I always believe that industry is essential for any growth model that we have in the world and in North America. Actually, I think industry is one of the pillars of this strategy. So I think we are in for 5-10 years of a lot of change on the model of industry, but I still don't know what's going to happen in terms of this, of the cost driver on production. And my concern gets bigger when I look at the ease of developing new suppliers, which that would be my question to you, Alejandro. It's how easy is to develop a new supplier, and how easy is to have dual source. And I think that's why both of you are talking about, the relocation of the same suppliers. But can you give us a little bit of insight on your take on that?
I think that, if we go back prior to this COVID-19 era, everybody was talking the same language. It's so complicated to change from one supplier to another. And and to be more fair with the sourcing people, the people that works on that work, the total landed cost, it had a lot of variables, but all of a sudden we have added new variables, because now we have something called business continuity. What is going to be the cost that is going to have into your goods, that whatever supplier is going to be providing, if you have an interruption of the manufacturing side? And that can be driven by politics, that can be driven by, a complexity on the logistics. Prior to this era, what we were seeing, it was the basic stuff when it comes into getting the calculation of a total land cost. So it made it too complicated to someone to say, or even think about the possibility of changing a supplier to another, because it was always the basic cost drivers. But now, when you add the complexity of risk and the risk mitigation, that is going to be associated on a better way to say it on this business continuity, what is going to happen with that? And those are going to be drivers that are going to be added into the equation on how to get this calculation done. And for sure, that is going to push a little bit the development of new suppliers, that let's be honest, the total cost is going to be higher. I don't see a way that we can find a cheaper cost, just, comparing one-to-one. But at the long term, I think that we're going to have to find a way to make it happen. Every single industry have found, and they have proved that they can find a way. But I believe that nowadays, Emilio, is that we're going to have to add some variables that before this time were not part of the equation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think for us, every week, and I would like to ask you what you're seeing, Didi, but the business continuity part, it just becomes more relevant. And I think it's because we were always dealing with business continuity, but I think more from an internal processes, our machines, our preventive maintenance system working well enough, maybe a little bit of our suppliers and, how they're inventorying. But I think business continuity today goes beyond that. So what are you seeing in terms of the discussion around business continuity, and what does it entail? I mean, what's included in that conversation of business continuity?
Well, prior to the events of the last couple of years, I would say that there was a lot of discussion with my clients related to business continuity, but it depended on the industry type. So for my biotech and pharma clients, that was a big deal because of the length of time to be qualified and have your suppliers qualified, and concerns about redundancy in your manufacturing process, because you can't just replace a vaccine manufacturing facility in a short period of time, for example.
Correct.
I also saw it with my aerospace clients because for exactly the same reason. It takes time to have every input into a structural part of an airplane to be qualified. And as a matter of fact, we did, starting in about 2012 to about 2014 or 15, for one of my aerospace clients, I did a business continuity risk assessment for them in 16 of their global manufacturing plants. And we were looking at all types of the risk. We were looking at, utilities. We were looking at single points of failure in the facility. We were looking at their supply chain, where they only had a single source of supply. We were looking at natural disasters. I can tell you that not once did I or anyone else on their team or my team bring up the concept of a pandemic. It just was not even on the radar screen. And now I look back and I think, wow, we really missed that. But then again, I'm not sure exactly how you would mitigate for that type of risk. Nonetheless, I think that, those were industries that were talking a lot about business continuity. We also saw some discussion right after Katrina here, particularly in the chemical and petrochemical market, oil and gas, around resiliency. And we were looking for cities that were resilient if you're going to invest your money there. But now I think the conversation has come back around, and we're not just looking at, where can I locate in order to make that facility more resilient, but how do I design my entire supply chain so that it in itself is much more resilient?
Sorry to interrupt, but I think this concept, again, is fantastic, which is what makes a city resilient in your pre-COVID-19, at least. Then we can talk about that, and I'll ask for Alejandro on one aspect of the resilience or the business continuity, which is the social license. But in your opinion, what makes a city resilient in order for site selection criteria?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the first thing that you can do to make your location decision more resilient is go to a city or a community that is less prone to interruptions in production, because they have just less chance of natural disaster risk, or maybe they're positioned close to your market or close to your supplier, so you're just reducing that risk by making a specific location decision. Having said that, there are certain types of operations. So the petrochemical sector is a perfect example of where it is primarily located in the United States along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and Texas. These are areas that are very prone to hurricanes and flooding. But the cost of locating somewhere else is so much higher that companies are willing to take those risks. So if you're looking at where you're going to locate and what makes one city more resilient than the other, it's really what kind of emergency plans have they designed? How have they structured their response so that they can quickly evacuate people but bring them back in? How quickly can they get the power back on? I mean, that's one of the biggest issues. Do they have plans to accommodate large numbers of people that maybe have been flooded out of their houses? I mean, one of the biggest risks to manufacturing operations after a hurricane is not that the facility itself is damaged. It's not that it doesn't have power. It's that its workers don't have anywhere to live.
Yeah, that's right.
If a city has a plan for how they're going to get people back into the community, I mean, we saw people leave in droves from Louisiana and the Gulf Coast of Mississippi after Katrina, and some of them have never returned because they didn't have housing to go back to. So I think that is one of the most critical things.
You know, another thing that I believe is going to become part of these variables that we've seen right now in COVID-19 is, I'm going to say, the institutional architecture that allows for private sector to coordinate with government for the emergency response programs. And I think this has been very evident in some states in Mexico. I think the same is in the US, where the better the ability of the city to have the different stakeholders interact, the unions, the companies, the government, the health sector, is the ability to shield better that location or to react better in that location for business continuity. So I think, Didi, this is also going to become part of these factors. But I wanted to make. Go ahead, Alejandro.
Sorry, Emilio. I wanted to add something else that goes aligned into what in line into what you guys were saying, which is, you know, the reputation of a corporation, the reputation of a manufacturing facility. In the, you know, I will say that in the last couple of decades, all of the manufacturing facilities, all of the companies that we have held, they were looking for the best site to set up their facilities, right? And I would, you know, to be quite honest here, most of the times everybody was excited about getting an investment in whatever they decided to go, right? So in terms of what the people was thinking about it, and you know, it was always good news for everyone. And more likely companies were exclusively dedicated to do manufacturing. And of course they were taking care of people and everything, right? But I think that nowadays something that is getting a lot of attraction today is what is happening in the you know, in the environment, what is happening with the impact that the company is having outside with the society. And I think that companies need to get better to hear that, so they can react to that, and they can take care of their own reputation. Nowadays, it's just so complicated to follow up and keep track of what is happening in social media, for example. But you need to have some ears in there. You need to make sure that the sound that your company is getting out there is the type of sound that you want to send. It's something that it can be, and it can end up being a tremendous issue for the continuity of a manufacturing facility. Besides, you can have all of the best manufacturing practices and all of the best equipment and, you know, installations and whatsoever. But if you don't have the people that is engaged with you, if you don't have the society engaged with you, and also you're sharing some of the society that you're being part of as a corporation, this is going to be something that is going to be part as well of the total landed cost, going back to the finding a different supplier. So I think that this is something that companies will need to add into their next site selection strategy.
Yeah, I think the social part of it, social license, as we've been calling it, is a tremendous factor. I think especially for higher impact projects, right? In terms of size, industries, infrastructure, natural resources. And I think you hit it spot on, Alejandro. I think it is today one of the most critical factors, not only for business continuity once you're in the city, because I think this is a change of mindset of the community overall. But I think especially for new projects, is we better learn from this and make it part of the process going forward. If we're caught in the transformation of culture and the facility already there, you have to manage that risk. But I think for us in the site selection business, for you know, all the three of us in this call, it has to become part of the new reality and the new criteria for selecting locations. I don't know if you want to add something. Go ahead,
Emilio, for global location strategies, our purpose is to match companies and communities for long-term sustainable success. Yeah. And sustainable means different things to different people, but we're talking about enduring success. But that is not just on the economic side, that's also on the environmental and the social side. And so in our process, we take into account environmental, social, and economic aspects so that we can look at the true impact of this facility, this new facility, on any given community. So anytime you have development, there's going to be negative externalities. I mean, you're taking property out of a greenfield status, you know, you're using water, you have emissions into the air. So there's always some negative externalities, but you want to make sure that you don't just put a company where it's most economically beneficial to do so, but also where those negative externalities are most easily absorbed and offset by the positive impacts. So for example, we have a project right now in Arizona that we're looking at 2 different locations, not that far apart. And one of them is situated where there's an aquifer that is strained. In another location, there's plenty of water. You don't think of the desert as having plenty of water, but there are places where you can have lots of water. And so that's a part of the decision. You know, it's not just what will it cost us to develop one location versus the other, and what is the actual cost of the water, but what is the societal cost of that water in the long term?
Yeah, I think, you know, we had the last session of this morning coffee was with John Elkington, who I know you know and have read Didi. I know Alejandro and I know him personally. And I think this is the part of sustainability that we need to refer to right now, which is this 3-dimensional sustainability definition, which includes the environment, as you're saying, the social impact, and of course the economic or development possibilities. And I do agree with you. I think in a lot of cases we have had the intention of not to talk about impact, right? But absolutely everything that humans put their hands on or their feet on has some type of environmental or sustainability impact. I think what we have to do is actually talk about it more openly and redefine the variables that make it such, and I think, or make it most beneficial for one place to the other. I think states and municipalities, cities have to define where they are in terms of attraction of investment with this consideration, but they have to take the 3 of them into consideration, because we need to make sure that we provide for, you know, good jobs for people that are good to the community and that impact the environment, or as you can say, you know, can minimize that impact or leverage that impact the best way possible. And with this, I want to also, I'm looking here at my phone, but because Joel is sending me some questions through my WhatsApp, and I would link this to what we're saying as you know, going into our closing remarks. But there are a couple of questions here related policy, government policies, and how much can they affect the actual site selection process. And I think, you know, 232s and, you know, these duty rates, certainly free trade agreements, and we'll jump from this to USMCA. But how efficient do you think they are? How sustainable do you think they are? And this is the question to both of you, whoever wants to take the first stab at it, in terms of site selection, the influence of government and policy on it.
Alejandro, you want to take that one?
Well, when I go first? Go ahead, Didi.
Well, I think there's 2 levels of regulatory impacts. One of them being at the national level. So when you're talking about duties and you know, certain environmental regulations, I mean, those impact a country's competitiveness. But if you look at the United States and Mexico, even though they're 2 countries, the regulations that exist from state to state vary dramatically. Not just the regulations, but the overall business conditions. I mean, you know, Tijuana is very, very different than Guadalajara, which is very different than Puebla, for example. The same thing in the US. You know, you've got, you know, Southeast, you know, South Carolina and Georgia have very different conditions than, say, a city in the Midwest or in the western half of the United States. So at the state level, I think that, you know, there's various levels of impact, some positive and some negative. moving forward, one of my concerns is that because of the budget crunches, states are going to look to ways to make up that revenue hole that they have right now, or to cut services. And I'm concerned about our economic development friends and what's going to happen to their budgets. And when they get cut, it impacts my ability to access the information that only they have access to help my clients understand what the different location opportunities are and to really flesh those out and do the due diligence.
Yeah. But I think that, you know, in terms of public policy, you mentioned, you know, free trade agreements, Emilio, and I think that USMCA is bringing something that adds a lot of, you know, it's a legal framework. Every single project needs to have a legal framework that supports the decision. And I think that if we think about this North America as a region, and just like you say, Didi, I mean, I really believe that the development of the future supply chains is going to be more like happening on regions. And now we have, you know, something that is giving certainty to investors, which is something that we didn't have. You know, it was up in the air until recently. And now we have on top of that, whatever is going to be happening at the, you know, local municipalities or even local states, that I completely agree with you, that it is going to change the decision on where they want to go. But I think that as a region, we have really good news. We still have some challenges, of course, and this is not associated to specific rules or specific sayings. We will see tariffs, we will see that type of war happening everywhere, not only here or not only within the US and China. This is happening in some other places as well. I mean, let's not forget about Brazil and the complications that we have as a country in Mexico dealing with Brazil. Is not as easy as we believe. So having this USMCA in place is setting up a legal framework, as I said, and I think it's going to be very beneficial for the region. It's still inside of each one of the countries and going deeper into the states. That is going to be whatever is going to be driving the final decision on where to go. But I think that as a region, it makes us very attractive. It makes any other investor from overseas to think about this as a safe bet. You know, it's a safe place to go and do an investment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think USMCA is great news in terms of certainty. I still believe that this coalition that we have been building, maybe unintentionally, but of the private sector pushing governments on the region to be coordinated, we cannot let it go to waste. I think we gotta make sure that we keep the pressure on saying what we want is a certainty on the rules of the game. I always say we are okay with risk, but the only thing we want to know is if we're playing football or baseball. Once we know we're in that field, we're able to manage the risk associated with the game, right? Including the evolution of it, which is for me all the sustainability, social license. We are willing and enabled, prepared to take on that challenge. But my concern is that we continue, due to politics and to winning a couple of votes here and there, and not only the US and Mexico, but also Mexico, because we're coming into elections in the US and then the biggest midterm elections in the history of Mexico. So we are in the region for 18 months of election process, right? Which is, it's too long, right? So we better be prepared to coordinate. I think this, the participation of the organized civil society, as we're seeing in other factors of our lives, but from the industrial point of view, is very, very important. So we make sure that we keep pushing our governments to make sure that policy is not driven only to gain votes, but it's driven for a strategic decision on the region and for competitiveness on the region. So this is one of the things that I encourage everybody that is in the call today, listening to us, is making sure that we keep being part of the community, participating, you know, really saying what we think, and making sure that governments at least here are part of the story, so they can continue to build on this framework of USMCA, which I would like to start closing now, but asking you, where do you see USMCA, and specifically, where do you see the US, let me say, winning in this with this new USMCA and the situation that we're facing in terms of supply chains, nearshoring, that both of you have been talking about, and then of course allow Alejandro to talk about where Mexico can win.
Well, I think that you bring up a really important point about risk, because one of the things that coronavirus has really exposed is that corporations cannot stand risk, particularly the uncertainty associated. They don't mind risk as long as they know how to calculate what the risk is, and they can include that in their calculations of what they expect for an internal rate of return. I think that USMCA has definitely set the framework so that we know what the playing. I think there's still some things that need to be worked out, but generally speaking, we know what the rules of the road are, so that companies can start making decisions based on something that they can trust is going to remain in place. I think that the relationship between the United States and Mexico is very symbiotic. Mexico has a very young demographic. They have, from a cost perspective on the labor, it's much cheaper than it is in the United States. I think 80%, and Mexico, to its credit, and I think, about the time that NAFTA came along, Mexico moved from a more of an export-led model, where they were just exporting resources, so oil and things like that, to really focusing on production. So now 80% of Mexico's exports are manufactured goods, and almost, not all of them, but a large portion of them go to the United States. So it's a very symbiotic relationship. I think we would be remiss if we didn't include Canada in this discussion, but I think Canada has been losing out to Mexico. One, because its demographic is not nearly as strong and its costs are higher. And if you look at the Canadian cities, they're not very well connected. So they're mostly trading with whatever city is on the other side of the border in the US, and they are trading amongst one another. I think the one exception to that is the oil and gas resources that come out of Alberta. But I see that continuing. I think a lot of the innovation technology is going to be developed in the United States, but in a lot of cases deployed in Mexico. I think the automotive sector is going to remain strong. I think that there's going to be a shakeup in the supply chain of the automotive sector, and I think that there's going to be winners and losers in that, but I don't really see it as like the US wins and Mexico loses or vice versa. It's more, how sophisticated the company is and how quickly they're able to adapt to some of these changes. So the multinational, the OEMs, the tier one multinational companies are going to adjust fine, because this is what they do day in and day out, is take into account these changes in risk and cost and all of these things on a daily basis. But some of the smaller tier 2, tier 3 companies may not have the ability to adjust quite as quickly, and they may suffer the consequences from that. But I really, the US definitely has an advantage as it relates to energy infrastructure and the price of energy. So anything that is very energy intensive and less labor intensive, I think will be drawn to the US side of the border. And then anything that's more labor intensive, less energy intensive, will migrate south of the border.
Alejandro?
I will add into that certainly USMCA is going to add some level of challenge for existing manufacturing facilities, in terms of compliance, in terms of regulations. We still need to find out if both governments, and I'm going to be talking about the US and Mexico relation, but also the Canadian and Mexican relation, because it's different when it comes into labor specific rules and regulations. We need to find out how ready the government officials are to start the process, but at the same time, companies need to start looking at that, because certainly it's going to add a complexity in terms of compliance. So in one side is going to be something that it looks and is moving forward to build a more fair relationship when it comes into the how competitive a country is going to be in terms of cost of labor. But certainly at the same point, it's setting up this is not longer a battlefield. You know, we are together on this as countries. We have a great integration when it comes into manufacturing. I really don't see this in any other way than a region. And I think like any other regions in the world, it's just like a strategy game. Someone is going to have to be doing something and somebody else is going to be doing something else. But one cannot live without the other. You know, and that has been proven, I think. And the best way to understand that is that if we take a look into what USMCA is looking for, of course, there is always going to be winners and losers. There's always going to be people that say that somebody, you know, did better than the other. But to be quite honest, there are a lot of things that are associated with people. You know, this is going to be going back to the sustainability and making sure that people is being paid fairly. And I think that this is going to be also associated with the development of an economy in this region. Mexico has been growing in terms of internal consumption as well. You can see when you tour some of the cities that you were mentioning, Didi, and if you remember those cities 20 years ago, it was completely different. So the level of integration that we have, and now let me say, the big aspiration that the federal government is showing to develop some other cities besides the usual suspects, is going to add some, you know, new challenges in terms of logistics. It can be adding a lot of things that will make or not make sense for somebody. But trust me, I believe that when you bring something from China all the way to the US, having something like that in Yucatan might be easier than China. You know, it's just we're gonna have to understand that the framework is so good to have that is going to be given a lot of opportunities for people to decide on which direction they want to go, and understanding that the integration that we have as a country, and trust me, even though we are different, we are neighbors, and that geographical location is never going to change. So we need to take advantage, and I guess that USMCA is giving us this additional certainty that everybody needs.
Yeah, I mean, I will close with this. I think that, as both of you are saying, I think we have the framework, the legal framework, and the market shift that allows us to think about North America as a region with very, very high potential. And I think together, Canada, Mexico, and the US, we have, and only together, the demographic, the energy, the natural resources, and the market to actually grow and to be very optimistic about the future under this new sustainable environment. So I hope that we can keep pushing our governments, the three governments, to really have this collective vision of the region. That would be one of my conclusions in this morning conversation with you. And the second one is, I think risk and, you know, together with business continuity, or the risk of business continuity, has to be part of your site selection and operational strategy. I think the positive thing for me is that there are ways on how to do it and how to assess for it and how to try to measure it, which I think are very efficient, and to have your, I'm going to say, emergency response programs to adapt to this. Now we never consider pandemics. You said between 2012 and 2015, Didi, when you were doing it. Well, we missed it in 2016 and 17 when we were negotiating USMCA, because there is no provision for pandemics. So we missed it. More people together, we missed it after you. So I'm not surprised it wasn't there. But we will make it as part of our corrective actions. And I think this will allow us to think about other risks that we have to put in there. But I would insist to the people seeing, watching this and listening to us, is that there are ways to assess for it. And that's kind of what we do every single day. Try to look at what are the alternatives for making good decisions on your current operations and on your future operations. So having said this, go ahead, Didi.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, what we really do as site selectors, and I'm sure Alejandro would agree with this, is that we're trying to help companies find the best location for them, which could be a site or a building, but it's definitely a community which resides in a state, which is in a country, where they have the lowest cost, the best quality environment to operate, so best workforce, best, regulatory environment, et cetera, and the least risk. So if you can find all three of those in one location,
Yes.
then that's obviously the optimal location. What we do is help them understand what the position of each community is and how they compare to one another on those three factors so that you can accurately weigh the trade-offs. And one of the things that I think, we're living in an uncertain world. And so if I could encourage companies what they should be doing when they're looking at the realignment of their supply chain and, making decisions about how and where to deploy their assets around the world, is to do scenario planning. So what happens if the supply chain breaks down between East Asia and the US? I mean, how does that impact my business? What happens if we don't have a coronavirus vaccine for another couple of years? How does that impact my business? What happens to my business if we overcome this coronavirus really quickly? So that you can look at all of those different scenarios, because we just don't know which one is going to happen. And try to make a decision that is maybe not the best for any particular one or for all of them, but the one that might be the least bad in any situation. And that's something that site selection consultants can help companies work through when it comes to the location strategy piece of that.
Yeah, I think you're. Go ahead,
sorry, I will add into that, Didi, that in the when someone is thinking about a site selection or a relocation or an expansion or whatever it can be, one of the things where we start is that it is our job is to challenge their business drivers, is to understand what is the main reason why they want to go and do this, because sometimes might be better to stay wherever they are. Sometimes we have learned in the past that helping companies to learn a little bit more and have an outsider to challenge a little bit the decisions can actually help them to build a better strategy. And sometimes the strategy can be different to where they started. And I think that that's the value added that we can have with all of the experience that we have, between the two firms that we are representing here today. And certainly, it's all about helping our clients to be more successful and be more productive. And that is a small word, but it's a huge concept. So I think that adding that into the equation from the very beginning is to challenge a little bit the business drivers and help them to make a better decision.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think it's have a process and then execution of that process. And the process needs to be innovated with the new things that we learn every single day. And so I would leave that as the final comment. Didi, thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge with us. It's fantastic establishing this relationship with you. And Alejandro, as always, thank you again for sharing the experiences. I'm sure that people that watched us today at least go home with a little bit of additional knowledge, and maybe if this helps you make a better decision tomorrow on one of your projects, then we've done our job. And thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next morning coffee.
Thank you so much.